I've had these 3 slabs of air-dried walnut sitting in my shop for almost 2 years, and for one of them at least, I think I just found the perfect project for it. After 10 years of woodworking, I'm finally getting the opportunity to work with some air-dried walnut. Really excited about it. The 2 larger slabs, I'm not quite sure what I have in store for them, but I know exactly what I want to do with this smaller piece. We have a window in the kitchen that is just begging to have a nice bench sitting under it. So that's what this is going to be used for. After we flatten it, we are going to do some nice edge treatments on it, really jazz it up, and then we're going to turn some legs and stretchers from maple to give it nice contrast from the dark, rich walnut. First on the agenda, got to get this bad boy flattened. All right, here's our slab, and it is just about 64 by 13, and I know it's 2 inches thick. 13, that's a great number because that means we could run it through our DeWalt planer without having to build some crazy router jig in order to flatten this thing. So what I do need to do is cut a piece of plywood for this to lay on. We will shim it and hot glue it and do whatever we need to do so it doesn't rock as we put it through the planer. Once one side is flat, we'll flip it over and get the other face. So in addition to the hot melt glue, I did drive in 2 number 6 wood screws through the plywood, through the shims, into the end of the slab. The reason I did that is because the hot melt glue is there to keep the shims in place. It's not going to do anything to keep the slab in position. If the slab moves, it's going to pop those hot glue joints pretty easily. So the screws will just keep this thing from sliding as we run it through the planer. Speaking of which, we're ready to go to that step. Quick word about safety. Make sure the workpiece is always supported on 2 points so it doesn't tip as it goes in or exits the machine. Right now it is supported by the table and the front roller, and then it is supported by the entire table, and as it exits it's still supported by the table, and before it has a chance to tip down it hits the front roller. So it's always supported at 2 points. All right, this thing is heavy. We don't want it swinging. You grab it as it flies through the air, you wrench your back, and your significant other says, "I told you to be careful." Obviously, passing material this wide puts more strain on the planer than passing narrow boards, so I have to take really light passes so as not to trip the internal breaker of the planer. I was turning the wheel less than a quarter turn each pass, which translates to about a 64th of an inch. So yeah, I had quite a few passes to make. And I just kept passing it through until the entire surface of the slab was planed. With one side flattened and cleaned up, we have a nice idea of what we're working with. This side of the board, we have a ton of curl and beautiful color variation. I think I'll leave that live edge intact as much as possible. This side, quite a bit plainer, but I am gonna have to cut about 8 inches off this end. There's quite a bit of checking here, and I don't think it would be structurally sound to put a leg through there. I wouldn't trust it. So we'll cut a few inches off and just make the bench a little bit shorter. Now, all we have to do is flip this over. We can run it through the planer by itself. We don't need the sled anymore because we have a flat reference face. Then after that, we can work on the edges and turning the legs and stretchers. With our faces flat and parallel to each other, we can now concentrate on the edges. Easy enough to do. Run one edge along the jointer, then bring it over to the table saw, run that jointed edge along the fence. That way we could trim the opposite edge square and parallel to it. Then when that is done, we could put on our design hats and concentrate on the legs. All right, let's get to it. Before I rip a nice clean edge on the other side of this board, I did attach the Just Some Table Saw guide. You've probably seen it before in other videos or online. Basically, it presses down on the board with these rubber wheels and also guides the work against the fence as it's pushed through. Practically eliminates the risk of kickback, and also with a big heavy piece like this, it makes sure it stays on course as you push it through. Not sponsored. Just don't have a problem recommending a good tool. In fact, if any company were to send me a check, I wouldn't even cash it. My wife does the banking, so she would cash it for me. With our lumber all milled up, we're now going to concentrate on the leg mortises. We're going to go 2 inches from the edge and 2 inches from the end. On this side, I already trimmed off the part that had all that bad checking on it. On this side where we have the live edge, I drew a perpendicular line at my first opportunity, and we'll go in 2 inches from that point and 2 inches from the edge. Now for the legs, we're going to do a 7-degree rake and a 7-degree splay. Quick refresher course, when you're looking at the furniture head on, this is splay and this is rake. Now when we drill our holes, we're actually going to do a stepped mortise. This gives us a couple of advantages. One, it'll make the joint a little bit stronger, and two, it'll look a little bit neater because the shoulder of the leg tenon will be hidden in the mortise of the bench. Now when drilling the holes, there could be a lot of math involved, but thankfully some very bright woodworkers have come up with some online calculators to handle all that messy trigonometry, and I'll link to one of those below. Now because our rake and splay are both 7 degrees, it's going to make our setup a little bit easier. Let's pretend this offcut is the end of our bench where I'll be drilling the leg mortises here and here. Now because our rake and splay are the same, once again 7 degrees, our sight line will be a nice and easy 45 degrees relative to the center line of the slope of the drill press. And finally, our resultant angle. That's the angle where we will be drilling into the workpiece. And to get our 7-degree rake and splay, that number is 10 degrees. Again, we use the online calculator to figure that number out. So I built a 10-degree ramp to rest our piece on. All right, that's enough trigonometry, that's enough terminology. Let's drill some holes. With our mortises all drilled out, now it's time to make some legs to stick in them. That's the design I came up with for the legs. I made up 5 blanks, one just in case, and we'll throw those on the lathe. I'm going to use a roughing gouge to turn these into cylinders, and from there I'll go to the parting tool. Here I'm using a story stick to transfer some key dimensions to the spindle. Since we're making 4 legs, obviously we want to be very consistent with each piece. I then use a parting tool and calipers to get to the desired diameter. Here I'm using a Galbert caliper which has a built-in gauge. On the more narrow diameters, I have to use a traditional set of calipers, as the Galbert one can't read the smaller dimension. I then connect the dots with a square carbide tip tool to get the curve I'm looking for. I wish I was more adept at using a skew chisel, but I'm afraid I'm not, but I'm working on it. In the meantime, I'm using sandpaper to get the final shape, then I'll sand through the grits to get a smooth finish, free of scratch lines. With our legs turned, I can now show you really clearly why I did that step mortise. Here I did the same step mortise on a piece of scrap, then I cut it in half so we get a nice cross section so we see exactly what we're looking at. And with the step mortise, not only does the bottom of the tenon hit the bottom of the hole, but the shoulder of the tenon is supported all the way around. Whereas with a single hole, the shoulder is only supported right along this edge. So in theory, stronger. In practical terms, this is probably strong enough, but it's a little extra insurance, plus I think it looks neater as well. Okay, we're going to go back to the drill press. We're going to drill holes for these stretchers to fit into. And we can't just drill straight through, because think about it. If we were to drill straight through, then our leg is splayed at 7 degrees. Now it's not running parallel to the leg across from it. So our hole is going to be at 7 degrees as well. So we'll secure it on a jig, we'll raise it on one end, so our hole is at the right angle. I sketched out a couple of variations of the stretcher that runs side to side, and I think I'm going to go with the wider one. The skinnier one, the curve winds up being so gentle that it almost looks straight, and I don't think it complements the curve of the leg very well. So I'm going to turn a couple of these guys. With our side stretchers done, we now run into our first fairly big hiccup. This is the lumber I'm going to use to make the next piece, which is going to be the stretcher that ties the two side stretchers together. And my lathe is nowhere near long enough to turn this into a round stretcher. So we're going to have to shape it by hand. What I'm going to do is I'm going to mill this into a 1 1/4 inch square blank. I will then turn that into an octagon at the table saw. Then I'll use a combination of spoke shaves and a block plane to make that as round as I reasonably can, and then I will finish up refining it with lots and lots of sandpaper. I'm not expecting to get a perfectly round stretcher out of it, but I'm hoping that from the distance people will be looking at it, it's going to look pretty darn close enough. Worked out well. I had my doubts at some points during it. I'm like, is this thing going to be straight? Is it going to be wonky? It came out really nice. Now I just have to smooth out everything with sandpaper. Easy enough. Let's see, I have to notch the tenons because we're going to be wedging them. And then after that, we can start shaping the top. And then final sanding and finishing. Nice. For the top, I'm going to do a 15-degree miter on the front edge. And for a hot second, I thought about running it through the table saw on its edge to get that. But I thought the better of it. It just seems way too risky, not safe. I've got quite a few hours invested in this slab, not to mention the money. And I would hate for things to go wrong at this point in the project. So hand tools it is. Okay, I'm going to give myself some guidelines to plane to on the top face and the front edge. And hopefully this shows up well on camera. We've got a pretty nice even bevel going all the way down the length of the bench top. All right, now to tackle this end of the bench. On that side, we have the live edge. We're not going to touch it aside from cleaning it up. This, I want to do some sort of a compound sweeping curve thing. I have a thought in my head. I just got to make it come to fruition with the hand plane. All right, let's have some fun with it. We'll see what happens, and hopefully in half an hour or so, I don't hate myself. All right, prep work is done on the slab and already it looks really sweet. I filled in the knot holes with black epoxy. I sanded the top to 400 grit, the end grain to, I believe I went up to 800 grit with that. On the live edge side, there's two distinct textures we're dealing with. When I got this slab, it had really rough saw marks on this facet, and here is pretty much as you see it now. And it's just tons and tons of curl on top of each other. So what I did was I got rid of the saw marks and I polished it to about 800 grit. And my hope is that when we put some finish on it, it'll be a really nice contrast between a refined polished surface and a raw one. Okay, today's the day we button everything up. It's a good day. Last night I put a second coat of finish on the top. This morning we will glue in the legs, then I'll flip it over and scribe the legs so everything is nice and level on the ground. Then we'll put a final coat of finish on the top, and then we are done. All in all, took about twice as long as I expected. You'd think I would have learned by now. That always seems to be the case. All right, let's finish up. And finally, my intention was to scribe the bottoms of the legs and then saw to the line to get nice even footing on the ground, but there's so little material left to remove that I just put some sticky back sandpaper on the table saw and I'll just lap them flat. Thank you so much for following along. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. I'll be glad to answer them. And we'll see you in the next video.